Hey guys, tonight we descend even deeper into the strange, excessive, and often deeply uncomfortable world of royal bedrooms, where crowns did not come with boundaries, power replaced restraint, and entire kingdoms quietly adjusted themselves around the personal habits of one man. Before you get comfortable, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy these quiet, late-night explorations into history's stranger sides. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, along with the time on your end right now. It's always fascinating to see who's here, drifting through history together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or AC for that soft background hum, and let's begin. We start tonight with a man who didn't just misuse power, he normalized it. King John of England. John ruled from 1199 to 1216, and while history remembers him for signing the Magna Carta, losing vast territories in France, and generally disappointing everyone who expected competence, there was another side to his reign that made him deeply unpopular in a much more personal way. John didn't just rule badly. He behaved badly. His reputation among the nobility wasn't built on battlefield failure or poor administration alone. It was built on something quieter, more invasive, and far more uncomfortable. He couldn't be trusted around other people's families. John had a habit of taking what he wanted, and that included women. Not discreetly. Not carefully. And certainly not respectfully. Chroniclers at the time, people who were usually quite comfortable ignoring violence, corruption, and brutality, felt the need to write about his behavior in unusually blunt terms. They described him as lacking restraint. As someone who did not abstain from the wives and daughters of his nobles. Which, in medieval language, is about as close as you get to saying, this man made everyone uneasy. And this wasn't rumor. It was pattern. Noble families began to notice that when John visited, things changed. Households became tense. Wives were kept closer. Daughters were watched more carefully. Servants were suddenly more alert. Because a royal visit, which should have been an honor, became something closer to a risk. Some accounts suggest John maintained dozens of mistresses. Not relationships. Not romances. Just presence. And the problem wasn't just personal. It was political. Because every action like that created resentment. Not loud rebellion at first. But quiet anger. The kind that builds slowly. Imagine hosting your king. Feeding him. Welcoming him into your home. And knowing that while he sits at your table, he may also be undermining your household in ways you cannot openly confront. That creates a kind of tension that doesn't disappear. It spreads. Some nobles began refusing to meet him without precautions. Others limited access to their own homes. And a few reportedly took extreme measures just to ensure nothing happened under their roof. Because how do you confront a king? You don't. You adapt. You endure. You remember. And over time, that memory becomes something larger. John's behavior didn't just damage relationships. It eroded trust. And trust, in a feudal system, is everything. Because power isn't just enforced through armies. It's maintained through cooperation. And John slowly destroyed that cooperation. Not just through taxation. Not just through war. But through personal conduct that made people feel unsafe in their own homes. And eventually, that resentment contributed to something much bigger. The Magna Carta. Often described as a step toward democracy. A limitation on royal power. A foundational moment in legal history. But beneath all of that, it was also a reaction. A group of nobles saying, in effect, we cannot continue like this. John may not have intended to reshape history through his personal behavior. But he did. Because when power crosses certain lines for long enough, people find a way to push back. Even if it takes everything to do it. And that's how we begin. Not with glory. Not with triumph. But with discomfort. Because that's often where the truth is. We move from England to France, where power didn't just become unstable, it became unpredictable in a way that made even the strongest nobles uneasy. Charles VI of France. Charles ruled from 1380 to 1422, and unlike John, whose problems were rooted in behavior, Charles's story begins with promise. He was young when he took the throne. Energetic. Capable. Surrounded by advisors who believed he would restore stability to a kingdom that desperately needed it. For a while, he did exactly that. But then something changed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it came in episodes. Moments where Charles would lose control. At first, they were brief. Confusion. Disorientation. Sudden bursts of fear or aggression that didn't match the situation. But over time, those moments became longer. More intense. Harder to ignore. One of the earliest and most shocking incidents came during a military expedition. Without warning, Charles turned on his own knights. Men who had sworn loyalty to him. Men who had ridden beside him. He attacked them. Killed several before he could be restrained. There was no clear reason. No strategic explanation. Just a sudden break from reality. After that, everything changed. Because now the court had to deal with something far more difficult than a difficult king. They had to manage a king who could not always recognize reality. Charles began to experience delusions. At one point, he believed his body was made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically. Literally. He refused to move without support, convinced that even the smallest impact could shatter him. Servants were ordered to wrap him in layers of padding, reinforcing his clothing so he could sit, stand, or walk without breaking. Imagine trying to run a kingdom under those conditions. Decisions delayed. Orders questioned. Authority weakened. Because if the king believes he might shatter at any moment, how do you ask him to lead an army? How do you expect consistency? And yet, the kingdom continued. Because it had to. Advisors stepped in. Power shifted quietly behind the scenes. Decisions were made in his name, even when he wasn't fully aware of them. But that created another problem. If the king isn't in control, who is? Different factions began to form. Nobles aligning themselves with whoever seemed closest to real authority. Alliances shifting. Tensions building. And in the middle of all this, Charles's personal life continued. He had a queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who tried to maintain order, to keep the image of stability intact. But alongside her, there was also a mistress. Odette de Champdivers. She became something unusual in this situation. Not just a companion. But a caretaker. She stayed with Charles during his worst periods. Helped calm him. Comforted him when he was afraid. Listened to his fears about breaking, about losing himself. In a court filled with politics and ambition, she became something quieter. Consistent. And that kind of consistency mattered. Because everything else around him was unstable. But even with that support, the damage was already spreading. France didn't just have a struggling king. It had a divided court. A weakened central authority. A system where power was no longer clearly defined. And that instability had consequences. Civil conflict. Rival factions fighting for control. A kingdom distracted from external threats. Including England. Which took advantage of the situation, leading to further losses and long-term consequences that reshaped the region. All of this. Because the center could no longer hold. And unlike John, whose behavior pushed people to resist him, Charles created something different. Uncertainty. Because you can plan around a cruel king. You can resist an unfair one. But a king who is unpredictable. Who shifts between clarity and confusion. Who cannot always control his own actions. That's something far harder to manage. And so the court adapted again. Not through confrontation, but through control. Quietly guiding decisions. Managing appearances. Keeping the structure intact even as the foundation weakened. Because removing a king wasn't simple. Replacing him wasn't always possible. So they worked around him. And in doing so, they created a system where the crown remained. But the power behind it became something else entirely. Charles VI didn't intend to destabilize his kingdom. But intention doesn't always matter. Because when power is concentrated in one place, any instability at the center spreads outward. Slowly at first. Then all at once. And by the time it's visible to everyone, it's already too late to contain. So now, as we continue, keep that shift in mind. Because we're moving from instability into something far more deliberate. A king who didn't lose control. He used it. Peter of Castile. And his idea of love was something far more dangerous. As we move forward, the tone shifts again. Because the next king didn't lose control, and he didn't drift into chaos. He understood exactly what he was doing. Peter of Castile. Also known, depending on who you ask, as Peter the Cruel, or Peter the Just. Which already tells you everything you need to know. He ruled from 1350 to 1369, and his reign was defined by contradictions. Loyalty and betrayal. Love and violence. Justice and brutality, often happening at the same time, sometimes in the same moment. Peter didn't approach relationships the way other kings did. There was no subtlety. No distance. No separation between emotion and action. When he loved someone, it was intense. Obsessive. All-consuming. And when that love was challenged, it turned dangerous. Early in his life, Peter became deeply attached to a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla. Their relationship wasn't simple. Some sources suggest they were secretly married. Others say it was never formalized. But what matters is how Peter treated it. To him, it was real. And that belief shaped everything that followed. Because politically, Peter was expected to marry for alliance. To strengthen ties. To secure support. So he did. He married Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman. The marriage should have stabilized his position. Strengthened his alliances. Given him legitimacy. Instead, it lasted 3 days. After that, Blanche was imprisoned. Locked away in a castle. Removed from public life. And left there. For the rest of her life. Because Peter chose Maria. Not quietly. Not discreetly. Openly. And in doing so, he sent a message that echoed through the court. Political expectation meant nothing to him. Personal desire came first. And that kind of decision doesn't stay personal for long. Because Blanche wasn't just a wife. She was a political connection. A link between kingdoms. And by discarding her so completely, Peter wasn't just making a personal choice. He was creating enemies. But Peter didn't adjust. If anything, he leaned further into it. Maria became central to his life. His court. His decisions. Even after her death, Peter insisted on recognizing her as his true wife. Declaring their relationship legitimate after the fact. Not for politics. Not for diplomacy. But because, in his mind, it had always been that way. And this is where Peter becomes difficult to categorize. Because this wasn't just indulgence. It was insistence. A refusal to separate emotion from authority. And when that kind of mindset extends beyond relationships, it becomes something else entirely. Because Peter didn't just love intensely. He reacted intensely. To betrayal. To opposition. To anything that threatened his control. Nobles who opposed him didn't just lose influence. They disappeared. Rivals weren't just defeated. They were eliminated. And sometimes, those lines blurred. A political disagreement could become a personal vendetta. A personal slight could become a public execution. There are accounts of Peter watching executions from his palace. Not hidden away. Not distanced. Present. As if reinforcing a point. That his authority wasn't just absolute. It was immediate. And that created a court unlike the others we've seen. Because here, the danger wasn't unpredictability. It wasn't indulgence. It was intensity. Everything mattered more. Every action carried weight. Every decision had consequences that could arrive quickly. And in that kind of environment, people don't just adapt. They become cautious in a different way. Not just avoiding offense, but avoiding attention altogether. Because attention, in Peter's court, could be dangerous. Whether it came from admiration, or from disagreement. And yet, despite all of this, he maintained control. For years. Because fear, when applied consistently, can be effective. But it comes with a cost. It isolates. It reduces trust. It creates a system where loyalty isn't based on respect, but on survival. And systems like that don't hold forever. Eventually, resistance builds. Not openly. Not immediately. But quietly. Until it finds a moment. And for Peter, that moment came from within his own family. His half-brother, Henry. A rival. A challenger. Someone who represented an alternative to Peter's rule. Their conflict wasn't just political. It was personal. And when it ended directly. Henry killed Peter himself. Not through distance. Not through strategy alone. But face to face. And with that, Peter's reign ended the same way it had been defined. Intensely. Because a rule built on fear and personal force often collapses in the same way. Directly. So now, as we continue, notice the shift again. From instability to intensity. And next, we move into something else entirely. A king whose personal life didn't just create tension in the court, but fractured the entire structure around him. Edward II of England. And his story is one of attachment, power, and the consequences of putting one above the other. Now we move into a story where power didn't just become unstable or intense, it became personal in a way that reshaped the entire structure of a kingdom. Edward II of England. Edward ruled from 1307 to 1327, and from the very beginning, there was something different about him. Not in the sense of madness or cruelty, but in what he valued. Because Edward didn't prioritize power the way other kings did. He prioritized people. Very specific people. Most notably, Piers Gaveston. Piers wasn't just a friend. He wasn't just a companion. He was, by all accounts, central to Edward's life in a way that made everyone else uncomfortable. Not because closeness itself was unusual, but because of how visible it was. Edward elevated Piers quickly. Titles. Land. Influence. Everything that normally required years of loyalty and service was given almost immediately. And it wasn't subtle. At Edward's coronation, one of the most important ceremonial moments of his reign, attention shifted away from the king and toward Piers. He dressed extravagantly. Spoke freely. Moved through the court with a level of confidence that didn't match his position. And the nobles noticed. Because in a system built on hierarchy, sudden elevation disrupts everything. Power isn't just about what you have. It's about how you got it. And Piers hadn't earned it in the way they expected. Which made them uneasy. Then resentful. Then openly hostile. But Edward didn't adjust. If anything, he leaned into it. When pressure mounted, when nobles demanded that peers be removed from court, Edward complied. Briefly. He exiled him. And then brought him back. Again. And again. Like a cycle. Because for Edward, this wasn't just political. It was personal. And that distinction mattered. Because every time he chose peers over the expectations of the court, he reinforced something dangerous. That loyalty to him didn't matter as much as proximity to him. And that changed how people behaved. Nobles stopped focusing on governance. They focused on access. Who was close? Who had influence? Who could shape the king's decisions? And when that access felt limited to one person, resentment grew faster. Eventually, it reached a breaking point. The barons acted. They captured peers. And they executed him. Not quietly. Not secretly. Publicly. A message. And Edward's reaction was immediate. Grief. Anger. Loss that wasn't hidden or controlled. But even then, the pattern didn't change. Because soon after, another figure rose into that same space. Hugh Despenser the Younger. And this time, the situation escalated even further. Hugh didn't just hold influence. He expanded it. Land was seized. Power concentrated. Decisions shaped increasingly around his position. And once again, the rest of the nobility found themselves pushed outward. Not ignored. But sidelined. Which, in a feudal system, is almost worse. Because power doesn't disappear. It shifts. And when it shifts too far in one direction, everything else starts to tilt. By this point, Edward's queen, Isabella of France, had moved from frustration to action. Because unlike others in the court, she had something different. Position. Connection. Opportunity. She left England. Aligned herself with opposition forces. And returned. With an army. And this is where everything changes. Because for the first time, Edward's personal decisions led directly to his political downfall. He was captured. Imprisoned. Removed from power. And what followed remains one of the most discussed and unsettling ends to a king in medieval history. His death. Surrounded by rumors. Stories. Accounts that may or may not be true. But all of them pointing to the same idea. That his fall was not gentle. It was deliberate. Edward's reign wasn't defined by war. Or expansion. Or even traditional failure. It was defined by imbalance. A focus placed too narrowly. A system adjusted too heavily around one relationship. And a court that eventually refused to continue adapting. Because adaptation has limits. And when those limits are reached, it turns into resistance. So now, as we continue, notice the pattern building. John eroded trust. Charles lost stability. Peter ruled through intensity. Edward created imbalance. And next, we move into something different again. Not attachment. Not instability. But excess. A king who didn't just bend the rules. He rewrote them entirely. Henry VIII of England. And his story is where personal desire becomes national transformation. Now we step into a story that feels familiar, but only on the surface. Because this isn't just about indulgence, or attachment, or even imbalance. This is about transformation. Henry VIII of England. Henry ruled from 1509 to 1547, and unlike many of the kings we've talked about so far, he didn't begin as a problem. He began as promise. Young, charismatic, educated. He was athletic, admired, and seen as the kind of king who could strengthen England both politically and culturally. He wrote poetry. played music, engaged in diplomacy with confidence. At the start, there was no sign of what would come later. And that's what makes his story different. Because the shift didn't come from instability or sudden obsession. It came gradually. At first, everything followed expectation. He married Catherine of Aragon. A strong political alliance. A stable queen. A relationship that, for years, seemed functional. But there was one issue. No surviving male heir. And in a system where succession determined stability, that wasn't a small problem. It was a looming one. At first, it was just concern. Then frustration. Then something deeper. Because Henry didn't just want an heir. He began to believe he needed one. And from that belief, everything else followed. He convinced himself that the marriage was flawed. That it went against divine order. That it was the reason he had no son. And once that idea took hold, it didn't leave. Because again, there was no resistance strong enough to stop it early. Advisors debated. The church delayed. Diplomatic pressure increased. But Henry didn't step back. He pushed forward. He sought annulment. Not quietly. Not carefully. But persistently. And when it was denied, he didn't accept it. He changed the system. This is where Henry becomes something else entirely. Because unlike the others, who operated within existing structures, Henry altered the structure itself. He broke from the Roman Catholic Church. Established the Church of England. Positioned himself as its head. Not for ideology. Not for reform. But for control. So he could remarry. And that decision didn't just affect his personal life. It reshaped the entire country. Religion. Politics. Authority. All adjusted around one man's determination to get what he wanted. And that's the scale of his impact. Because now, personal desire wasn't just influencing the court. It was redefining the system. Then came Anne Boleyn. The woman who represented everything Henry believed he needed. He pursued her intensely. Wrote to her. Obsessed over her. And eventually married her. But once again, the pattern continued. No male heir. A daughter. Elizabeth. And just like before, what began as desire turned into frustration. Then suspicion. Then accusation. And was charged. Tried. Executed. And the shift was immediate. Because when power can elevate someone that quickly, and remove them just as fast, everyone else takes notice. The court becomes quieter. More careful. Because proximity to the king is no longer just opportunity. It's risk. Then came Jane Seymour. She gave Henry what he wanted. A son. Edward. And for a moment, everything stabilized. But Jane died shortly after. And with that, the cycle resumed. Anne of Cleves. A political match. Quickly dissolved. Catherine Howard. Young. Executed. Catherine Parr. Careful. Survived. 6 marriages. Each one reshaping the court. The alliances. The expectations. And by the end of it, Henry was no longer the promising young king. He was something else. Older. Heavier. Less controlled. More isolated. But still powerful. Because the system had already been altered to support him. That's the difference. Others were limited by the structures around them. Henry removed those limits. And once they were gone, there was nothing left to slow him down. Until time did. His reign left behind more than just stories. It left a transformed England. A new religious structure. A legacy of instability in succession. A court shaped by fear, adaptation, and constant change. And all of it traced back to something that started simply. A desire for control over his own life. But when that desire meets absolute power, it doesn't stay simple. It expands. Until it reshapes everything around it. So now, as we continue, notice how far we've come. From misuse of power, to loss of control, to intensity, to imbalance, to complete transformation. And next, we step into something that looks lighter on the surface, but carries its own kind of consequence. A king who turned excess into culture. Louis XV of France. And a court where indulgence became routine. From now we are moved into a court that didn't feel tense in the same way as the others. Not unstable. Not violent in bursts. Not defined by sudden collapse. Instead, it drifted. Slowly. Comfortably. Almost effortlessly. Louis XV of France. Louis ruled from 1715 to 1774, and at the beginning, everything seemed aligned for success. He was young, well-liked, and inherited a kingdom that had already been shaped into a symbol of power and elegance under his predecessor. There was structure. There was wealth. There was expectation. And for a time, Louis fit into that structure without disruption. But over the years, something subtle began to shift. Not through crisis. Not through rebellion. Through distraction. Because Louis didn't reject power. He simply stopped focusing on it. Instead, his attention moved elsewhere. Toward comfort. Toward pleasure. Toward a life that felt easier to manage than the weight of governing an entire kingdom. And at first, that doesn't seem like a problem. Because nothing breaks immediately. The court still functions. Decisions are still made. Appearances are maintained. But underneath that surface, something begins to loosen. Because when the center of power becomes less engaged, everything around it adjusts. Responsibility shifts outward. Influence redistributes. And into that space, other figures begin to step. One of the most notable was Madame de Pompadour. She wasn't just a mistress. She was something more structured. More stable. She advised Louis. Influenced decisions. Maintained a level of consistency that the king himself was no longer providing. And for a time, that worked. Because while Louis drifted, the system adapted. But adaptation has limits. Because alongside that stability, there was also expansion. Not of territory. Not of policy. But of indulgence. Louis maintained not just relationships, but a system around them. A rotating circle of companions. Carefully managed. Quietly organized. The Parc aux Serfs. A place that existed just outside the visible structure of the court. But was deeply connected to it. Young women brought in. Provided for. Then replaced. Not scandalous in the explosive sense. But constant. And constancy changes perception. Because when something happens often enough, it stops feeling unusual. It becomes expected. And in Louis's court, indulgence became part of the rhythm. Not hidden. Not emphasized. Just present. And that presence affected everything. Because while the king's attention was directed inward, toward comfort, toward routine, the larger structure of the kingdom required something else. Consistency. Focus. Engagement. And without that, small issues began to grow. Financial strain. Administrative gaps. Decisions delayed or softened. Nothing immediate. Nothing dramatic. But cumulative. Because drift doesn't cause collapse in a moment. It creates conditions for it over time. And during Louis's reign, those conditions began to form. Quietly. Gradually. A sense that the distance between the crown and the people was increasing. That the court was becoming something separate. A world of its own. And that separation matters. Because once power feels distant, it also starts to feel disconnected. And when it feels disconnected, it becomes easier to question. Easier to challenge. Even if that challenge doesn't come immediately. Louis himself didn't see this as failure. From his perspective, the system still worked. The court still functioned. The image of power remained intact. But image and reality don't always move together. And by the time the gap between them becomes visible, it's already wide. Louis XV didn't collapse his kingdom. But he set the stage. A structure that looked stable, but was slowly weakening beneath the surface. And that weakness wouldn't fully reveal itself until later. Because time, as we've seen, doesn't just preserve behavior. It amplifies consequences. So now, as we continue, we move towards something slightly different again. Not just indulgence. Not just drift. But chaos that feels almost surreal. A king who didn't just lose control of his court, but of himself. Christian VII of Denmark. And a story where power remained in place. But control quietly disappeared. Now a story starts where the structure is still there, the crown is still in place, the court still functions, but the person at the center begins to slip away from it entirely. Christian VII of Denmark. Christian ruled from 1766 to 1808, though ruled is doing a lot of work here. Because from early on, it became clear that something wasn't quite right. He was young when he took the throne. Inexperienced, yes, but more than that, unstable in a way that couldn't be easily managed or explained away. At first, it was dismissed. Eccentric behavior. Nervous energy. Moments of unpredictability that people assumed would settle with time. But they didn't. They intensified. Christian's actions became erratic. Unfocused. At times, completely disconnected from what was happening around him. He would laugh at inappropriate moments. Withdraw during important discussions. Lose interest in matters that required attention. And then there were moments that were harder to ignore. Behavior that unsettled the court. That made people uncomfortable not because it was scandalous, but because it didn't follow any clear pattern. And in a royal court, unpredictability without pattern is difficult to manage. Because there's nothing to adapt to. With John, you could anticipate behavior. With Peter, you could avoid provoking it. With Louis, you could work around absence. But with Christian, there was no consistency. And so, once again, the system adjusted. Not outwardly. Not dramatically. But quietly. Because when the king cannot reliably govern, someone else will. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee. The king's physician. At first, his role was simple. Care for Christian. Stabilize him where possible. But proximity creates opportunity. And over time, Struensee became more than a doctor. He became an advisor. Then a decision-maker. And eventually, the one actually governing. Because Christian, while still king in title, was no longer in control in practice. And this created a strange situation. A kingdom being ruled through a figure who wasn't officially meant to rule at all. But power doesn't always follow titles. It follows access. And Struensee had it. He began introducing reforms. Changes that, in another context, might have been considered progressive. But here, they came quickly. Without the usual resistance. Because the person who might have resisted was no longer fully present. And alongside this shift in power, another relationship formed. Queen Caroline Matilda. Young. Isolated. Married into a situation she couldn't control. And now, connected to the one person who seemed to have clarity. She and Struensee grew close. And eventually, their relationship crossed the line from political to personal. An affair. In a normal court, this would have been dangerous. Hidden. Carefully managed. But in this court, the usual checks weren't functioning. Christian didn't react. Didn't intervene. Didn't seem to fully register what was happening. Which allowed the situation to continue. For a while. Because even when a system bends this far, it doesn't disappear completely. There are always others watching. Courtiers. Advisors. Family members. And eventually, those watching begin to act. Not immediately. Not impulsively. But deliberately. Because what had formed wasn't just a scandal. It was a shift in control. And shifts like that rarely go unchallenged forever. A coup was organized. Struensee was arrested. Removed from power. And then executed. Publicly. A clear and final correction. The Queen was exiled. Separated from the court. From her position. From the life she had briefly stepped into. And Christian remained. Still king. But once again, surrounded by others who managed everything around him. Because removing him entirely wasn't simple. So the system reset around the same central figure. Just with different people controlling it. And that's what makes this story different. Because the problem wasn't excess. Or intensity. Or even deliberate misuse of power. It was absence. A crown without control. A position without presence. And a system that had to keep functioning anyway. So now, as we continue, notice how far the pattern has stretched. From misuse. To instability. To intensity. To imbalance. To transformation. To drift. To absence. And next, we move into something that feels almost theatrical. A king who embraced excess openly. Turned indulgence into identity. Charles II of England. The merry monarch. And a court that became something closer to a celebration than a system. From now we are arriving at a court that feels almost like a release after everything we've seen so far. Not because it's stable or disciplined, but because it leans fully into something else entirely. Energy. Excess. Movement. Charles II of England. Charles ruled from 1660 to 1685, and his story doesn't begin in comfort. It begins in disruption. Civil war. Exile. Years spent away from the throne, moving between countries, surviving rather than ruling. And that kind of beginning shapes a person. Because when Charles finally returned to England, when the monarchy was restored and the crown was placed back on his head, he didn't come back cautious. He came back determined. Determined to enjoy what he had nearly lost. And that decision set the tone for everything that followed. Because Charles didn't just rule. He lived. Openly. Constantly. His court became something different from the ones we've seen. Less tense. Less restrained. More alive. Theaters reopened. Art returned. Music, conversation, movement, everything that had been suppressed during the previous period came rushing back. And at the center of it all was Charles. Engaged. Charismatic. Present in a way that made people feel connected to him. But alongside that energy, there was something else. A pattern we've seen before, just expressed differently. Relationships. Charles had many. Not hidden. Not denied. Recognized. Mistresses who weren't kept in the shadows, but brought into the visible world of the court. Nell Gwyn. Barbara Palmer. And others. They weren't just private figures. They were part of the structure. Given titles. Given influence. Given space within the palace itself. And Charles didn't pretend otherwise. He acknowledged his children with them. Provided for them. Integrated them into the broader system. Which created a court that operated on a different kind of honesty. Not moral clarity. But openness. Because nothing was being hidden. And that openness changed how people reacted. There was still tension. Still resentment in some places. But it didn't build in the same way. Because what's visible can be understood. What's acknowledged can be managed. Charles's relationships didn't destabilize his rule in the way Edward's had. Because he balanced them. Not perfectly. But effectively enough. He maintained political awareness. Engaged with governance when necessary. And that made the difference. Because indulgence alone isn't what destabilizes a system. It's indulgence without balance. And Charles, for all his excess, maintained just enough balance to keep everything functioning. That doesn't mean there were no consequences. Because a court built around enjoyment still creates distance. Still shapes expectations. Still shifts focus away from long-term stability toward immediate experience. But it does so differently. More gradually. More subtly. And that's why Charles's reign feels lighter on the surface. Because the tension isn't explosive. It's diffused. Spread out across time, across choices, across moments that seem harmless on their own. Until you step back. And see the pattern. A king who prioritized life over structure. Experience over restraint. And a court that adapted to match that energy. But even in this lighter atmosphere. The same underlying truth remains. Power still sits in one place. And everything else still moves around it. So now, as we continue, we move into something darker again. A ruler who didn't just use fear. But curated it. Ferdinand of Naples. And a court where power wasn't just exercised. It was displayed. Permanently. At this moment we move into something that feels less like excess, and more like control taken to an unsettling level. Not loud. Not chaotic. But deliberate. Ferdinand of Naples. Ferdinand ruled in the mid-15th century, and on the surface, he appeared to be exactly what a kingdom needed. Efficient. Decisive. Capable of maintaining order in a region that required constant attention. And for the most part, he did that well. Rebellions were handled. Finances were stabilized. Authority was clear. But beneath that stability, there was something else. Because Ferdinand didn't just want control. He wanted it remembered. And that's where his story shifts into something far more unsettling. Most rulers deal with opposition in predictable ways. Imprisonment. Exile. Execution. Ferdinand did all of those. But he didn't stop there. He preserved them. After executing those who opposed him, he had their bodies embalmed. Prepared. And then displayed. Not publicly in the streets. Not as temporary warnings. But in a private collection. A space beneath his castle. A room filled with the preserved remains of those who had challenged him. Each one positioned. Maintained. Identified. As if they were part of something permanent. A gallery. And he didn't hide it. He showed it. To visitors. To diplomats. To anyone whose loyalty might need reinforcing. Walking them through. Explaining. Pointing out each figure and the reason they were there. Not in anger. Not in rage. But calmly. As if it were simply part of governance. And that changes the nature of power entirely. Because fear, when it's temporary, can be resisted. But fear, when it's preserved, when it's made into something lasting, it becomes something else. Something that lingers. Because now, the consequence isn't just death. It's memory. A permanent reminder of what happens when you oppose the wrong person. And in that kind of environment, people don't just obey. They internalize the boundary. They don't need to be told where the line is. They already know. Because they've seen it. Literally. And that creates a court that functions differently. Not through constant enforcement, but through constant awareness. Everyone understands the stakes. And when everyone understands the stakes, very little needs to be said. Ferdinand didn't need to react impulsively. Didn't need to repeat himself. Because the message was already in place. Permanently. But even here, the pattern holds. Because while fear can maintain control, it also creates distance. Trust disappears. Loyalty becomes conditional. And the system, while stable on the surface, becomes rigid underneath. Less adaptable. Less resilient. Because everything depends on maintaining that same level of control. And control, like everything else we've seen tonight, requires consistency. The moment it weakens, the structure around it begins to shift. Ferdinand managed to maintain it. For his lifetime. But systems built this way don't always translate smoothly after that. Because they rely so heavily on one person's presence. One person's method. And once that person is gone, the question returns. What holds everything together now? So as we continue, notice how the pattern evolves again. From indulgence, to absence, to celebration, to control. And next, we move into something that feels almost surreal in a different way. A ruler whose mind turned inward. Until reality itself became uncertain. Erik XIV of Sweden. And a court where paranoia slowly replaced clarity. Let's step into a court where the shift isn't just in behavior or control, but in perception itself. Where reality starts to feel unstable. Where certainty fades. Erik XIV of Sweden. Erik ruled from 1560 to 1568, and like many others we've seen tonight, he didn't begin as a problem. He began with promise. Educated. Curious. Interested in science, astronomy, the structure of things beyond immediate power. He was the kind of ruler who looked upward. Toward patterns. Toward meaning. But over time, that focus turned inward. And once it did, everything around him began to change. Erik developed a growing sense of suspicion. Not sudden. Not explosive at first. Gradual. Small doubts. Questions about loyalty. Uncertainty about intentions. Things that, in isolation, might seem reasonable. But they didn't stay isolated. They connected. And once they connected, they formed something larger. A pattern. Where trust became difficult. Where every interaction carried weight. Where every glance, every word, every silence could mean something more than it appeared. And in a royal court, where perception already matters. That kind of mindset spreads quickly. Because people notice. They adjust their behavior. Speak more carefully. Move more cautiously. Which, ironically, can reinforce the very suspicion they're trying to avoid. Because now everything feels controlled. Measured. And that can look like secrecy. Which feeds the cycle. Erik didn't just become cautious. He became convinced. Convinced that threats existed around him. That loyalty wasn't what it seemed. And once that belief settles, it's difficult to challenge. Because again, the same pattern applies. Who tells the king he's wrong? Who risks saying, this isn't real? Very few. So instead, the court adapts. They try to manage the situation. Guide him. Stabilize where possible. But internally, the pressure builds. And then it reaches a point where thought becomes action. One of the most defining moments of Eric's reign came during what should have been a controlled, contained situation. A group of nobles. Imprisoned. Already under his authority. No immediate threat. And yet, Eric entered. And personally attacked them. Killing one. Injuring others. Not as part of a broader strategy. Not as a public display. But as a direct result of what he believed in that moment. And once that line is crossed, everything changes. Because now the court isn't just adapting to behavior. It's reacting to unpredictability rooted in perception. And that's far harder to contain. Trust collapses. Not just in the king, but in the system around him. Because if decisions are being driven by something no one else can see or verify, there's no stable ground left. At that point, the response becomes inevitable. Not immediate, but inevitable. The nobility acts. Eric is removed from power. Not through dramatic battle. Not through public collapse. But through intervention. Contained. Isolated. And replaced. Because the system, once again, prioritizes stability over the individual. Eric spends the rest of his life imprisoned. Separated from the structure he once controlled. Left with the same thoughts that had shaped his rule. But without the ability to act on them. And that's where his story settles. Not in violence. Not in spectacle. But in quiet containment. Because sometimes, when instability reaches a certain point, the only solution a system can find is removal. So now, as we continue, take a moment to notice how far this has gone. From misuse, to instability, to intensity, to imbalance, to transformation, to drift, to absence, to performance, to control, to perception. Each one different, but all connected. Because each one shows what happens when power and limitation fall out of balance. And next, we move into something that feels almost like a return to the beginning. But on a much larger scale. A ruler whose influence extended across multiple kingdoms. Whose reputation blended charisma with constant motion. Sigismund of Luxembourg. And a court where movement itself became a kind of power. We enter into a figure who doesn't quite fit into a single category. Not purely indulgent, not unstable in the same way, not defined by one extreme. Instead, constantly moving. Sigismund of Luxembourg. King of Hungary. King of the Romans. Eventually Holy Roman Emperor. A man who didn't just hold power in one place, but carried it across regions, across courts, across shifting political landscapes. And that movement defined him. Because unlike the kings who became trapped in their own environments, Sigismund was rarely still. He traveled. Negotiated. Engaged with different courts, different cultures, different expectations. And in doing so, he developed something that many others lacked. Adaptability. He understood how to present himself differently depending on where he was. How to speak. How to act. How to maintain authority without always relying on force. But movement has its own consequences. Because when you're constantly shifting between environments, consistency becomes harder to maintain. Not just in policy, but in personal life. And Sigismund's personal life reflected that. He formed connections easily. Moved between relationships. Maintained a level of closeness with people across different courts. And while some of these relationships carried influence, others were more fleeting. Because again, movement changes things. It reduces permanence. Nothing stays fixed for long. Not alliances. Not attention. Not even identity, in some cases. And yet, despite that fluidity, Sigismund remained effective. Because he balanced it. He didn't allow personal behavior to fully override political awareness. Didn't let indulgence consume structure. Instead, he operated within both. Engaging when necessary. Stepping back when appropriate. Which created a different kind of court dynamic. Not centered in one place. Not defined by one rigid structure. But spread out. Influence moving with him. Power existing in motion rather than in stillness. And that changes how people around him behave. Because when power is mobile, access becomes uncertain. Courtiers don't just gather in one place. They follow. They wait. They position themselves for moments of proximity. Which creates a different kind of tension. Not the pressure of a fixed court. But the uncertainty of a shifting one. And in that environment, relationships become more strategic. Because time with the king is limited. Unpredictable. So every interaction carries weight. Every conversation matters more. And that can create its own form of instability. Not from excess. Not from absence. But from constant change. And yet, Sigismund managed it. Because he understood something important. That power doesn't always need to be fixed to be effective. It just needs to be recognized. And as long as people recognized his authority, the structure held. Even as it moved. Even as it adapted. Even as it stretched across different regions and expectations. So his story doesn't end in collapse. Or removal. Or isolation. It continues. A long reign. A complex one. Defined not by a single trait. But by balance within movement. And that makes him different from the others we've seen tonight. Because while many lost control in one way or another, Sigismund maintained just enough of it. Not perfectly. But consistently. And sometimes. That's enough. So now, as we move toward the final stretch of this journey, notice the contrast. Some kings were defined by what they couldn't control. Others by what they refused to limit. And a few. By how they managed to navigate both. But beneath all of it, the same structure remains. Power at the center. People around it. Adapting. Adjusting. Surviving. And that brings us back. To where we started. Not the kings themselves. But the world around them. Because in the end, that's what carries the weight of these stories forward. The witnesses. The quiet observers. The ones who lived inside these systems without ever controlling them. And as everything settles. As the noise fades. As the patterns begin to slow. We return to that quieter space. A corridor. Dimly lit. Empty. Footsteps fading in the distance. A door closing somewhere far away. And behind it. Another story. One that was never written down. But still happened. And that's where history often lives. Not just in what was recorded. But in what was experienced. Quietly. Consistently. Until it became memory. And with that, we let it slow. We let it settle. We let the world we've been walking through tonight fade back into silence. The castles haven't disappeared. They've just gone quiet. Because even when the kings are gone, the places remain. The rooms. The corridors. The doors that opened and closed 1,000 times without ever being written about. And if you stay with it long enough, you start to notice something. History isn't loud most of the time. It's quiet. It's repetition. A servant walking the same hallway every morning. A guard standing in the same place, watching the same doorway. A window opening to the same view, day after day, year after year. And inside that repetition, everything we talked about earlier continues. Just, softer. Less dramatic. But still there. Because for every decision a king made, someone carried it out. Someone delivered the message. Someone opened the door. Someone stood close enough to hear it, and then walked away like they hadn't. And over time, those small actions become the real structure. Not the crown. Not the throne. But the routine. The quiet agreement between people to keep things moving. Even when what they're moving around doesn't make sense. Think about that for a moment. A system where people wake up every day. And continue. Not because everything is right. But because stopping isn't an option. And that creates a kind of stillness. Not peaceful. But controlled. Careful. Measured. Voices stay low. Footsteps stay soft. Not out of fear all the time. But out of habit. Because once you've lived inside that kind of environment long enough, you don't need to be told anymore. You just know. What to say. What not to say. Where to stand. Where not to look. And maybe that's the part history doesn't really capture. Not the events. Not the names. But the feeling. What it was like to exist inside those walls. When nothing dramatic was happening. But everything still mattered. A glance. A pause. A silence that lasts just a second too long. And everyone notices. But no one reacts. Because reacting changes things. And change, in a place like that, is unpredictable. So people choose stillness instead. They let moments pass. They let things happen. And over time, that becomes the environment. Not built through decisions alone. But through thousands of small choices to remain quiet. To continue. To not interrupt what already exists. And that's how power sustains itself the longest. Not just through control. But through cooperation. Silent, constant cooperation. Even from the people who don't agree with it. Because disagreement requires space. And space wasn't something most people had. So they adapted. And adaptation, repeated long enough, starts to feel like normal. Even when it isn't. And that's where the story really settles. Not in the extremes. Not in the scandals. But in the quiet middle. Where most people lived. Where most days passed without record. But still shaped everything. So now. As everything slows even further. Imagine the castle at night. No voices. No movement. Just the structure itself. Holding everything that happened inside it. Every conversation. Every decision. Every moment we've talked about tonight. All of it still there. Just, quiet now. And somewhere inside. A single light. Faint. A reminder that even when everything else fades. Something always remains. Not loud. But present. And with that. We let it rest. History always has another door. And this time, we step into a court that looks disciplined on the outside, but underneath, it's built on control so tight it almost snaps. Ivan IV of Russia. Better known as Ivan the Terrible. Now, Ivan didn't start as terrible. That name came later. At first, he was just a boy surrounded by power, without protection. Raised in a court where nobles fought for influence. Where loyalty shifted quickly. Where even as a child, he learned one thing very clearly. Power isn't given. It's taken. And if you don't hold it tightly, someone else will. So when Ivan finally became ruler, He didn't hesitate. He centralized authority. Pulled control inward. Made it clear that the throne belonged to him, completely. But control, when taken to that level, doesn't stay balanced. It tightens. Ivan created a system known as the Oprichnina. A separate state within the state. Loyal only to him. Black-clad enforcers who rode through cities like shadows. Carrying symbols of death. Dogs' heads. Brooms. To sniff out betrayal. And sweep it away. And at first, it worked. Opposition disappeared. Fear spread. Control solidified. But fear doesn't stay contained. It expands. Because once you start seeing enemies everywhere, you stop needing proof. And Ivan began to change. He grew suspicious. Unpredictable. Trusted fewer people. Listened less. And eventually, even those closest to him weren't safe. One of the most chilling moments came not in war. Not in rebellion. But inside his own family. During an argument. A moment of anger. Ivan struck his own son. The heir. And the blow killed him. Not instantly. But slowly. And when Ivan realized what he had done, the control he had built around himself collapsed inward. Because for the first time, there was nothing to direct it at. No enemy. No traitor. Just himself. And that's the danger of absolute control. When everything bends outward, there's nothing left to hold you in place. Ivan ruled until the end. But the system he built left scars far beyond his lifetime. Because fear can hold a structure together. But it also weakens it from within. So now, we move again. Another court. Another kind of power. This time, something colder. Caligula of Rome. Caligula began his reign as a favorite. Loved. Welcomed. The people saw him as a fresh start. Young. Energetic. Different from what came before. And for a short time, he lived up to that. But then something shifted. An illness. A break. Something that changed how he saw the world. And after that, everything became unpredictable. But not in the same way as others. Caligula didn't just lose balance. He rejected it. He began testing limits. Not gradually. Not subtly. Openly. Declaring himself divine. Demanding worship. Not as a ruler. But as a god. And when no one challenged it, he pushed further. Because again, who tells the emperor no? He turned the court into something surreal. Appointments based on whim. Punishments without reason. Decisions that felt more like experiments than governance. At one point, he supposedly planned to make his horse a consul. Not as a joke, but as a statement. That power had no limits. That authority could redefine reality itself. And for a while, it worked. Because the system kept adjusting. People adapted. Stayed quiet. Survived. But there's a threshold. A point where unpredictability becomes instability. And once that line is crossed, the same pattern returns. Those closest to power become the ones who end it. Caligula was assassinated. Not by enemies far away, but by the people standing right beside him. Because when power becomes too detached from reality, it stops being sustainable. And the system corrects itself. Always. So now, we continue. Because there are still more stories. More kings. More patterns repeating in different forms. Next. We move into a ruler who believed he could reshape an entire empire through sheer will. Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor of China. A man who didn't just rule, but tried to control time itself. A ruler who didn't just want power over people. He wanted power over reality itself. Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor of China. Before him, China wasn't one unified empire. It was divided. Fragmented. States competing, fighting, constantly shifting. And Qin changed that. Through force. Through strategy. Through relentless expansion. He unified the states. Standardized currency. Weights. Writing. He didn't just rule a kingdom. He built a system. One that could function beyond individual regions. Beyond local control. And that kind of achievement requires something very specific. Absolute authority. Because to reshape something that large, you can't allow resistance to slow you down. And Qin didn't. He centralized everything. Pulled control inward. Made sure decisions flowed from one place only. Him. But just like we've seen before, when control becomes absolute, it doesn't stop. It expands. Because once you've unified a world around you, the next question becomes, what else can be controlled? And for Qin, the answer was unsettling. Time. Death. Memory. He became obsessed with immortality. Not symbolically. Not philosophically. Literally. He sent expeditions in search of elixirs. Consulted alchemists. Trusted those who claimed they could extend life beyond its limits. And in doing so, he began consuming substances meant to preserve him. That slowly poisoned him instead. Mercury. Taken in the belief that it would grant eternity. And that's the contradiction. A man who controlled an empire. Unable to control the one thing that applies to everyone. Mortality. But even beyond that, Qin tried to control what came after him. He ordered massive constructions. The early foundations of what would become the Great Wall. A vast network of defenses. Meant to secure the empire indefinitely. And then, something even more personal. His tomb. Not just a burial. A continuation. An entire underground world. The Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized soldiers. Positioned. Prepared. As if even in death, he expected to rule. To command. To maintain structure beyond life itself. And again, the pattern holds. Because the more control expands, the more fragile it becomes. Qin's empire didn't last long after him. Because systems built entirely around one person struggled to survive without that person. And when he died, suddenly, unexpectedly, the structure he created began to weaken. Not immediately collapsing, but shifting. Because control that rigid requires constant reinforcement. And without it, everything starts to move again. So Qin Shi Huang remains one of the most powerful figures in history. Not just for what he built, but for what he tried to overcome. Limits. And that's something we've seen throughout all of this. Different kings. Different styles. But the same underlying tension. How much control is possible before it becomes something else entirely? So now, we move again. Another ruler. Another kind of intensity. This time, a king who turned his own image into something larger than life. Louis XIV of France. The Sun King. A man who didn't just sit at the center of power, but became the center of it. A court that doesn't just revolve around power. It orbits a single person. Louis XIV of France. The Sun King. And that title wasn't accidental. Because Louis didn't just rule France. He positioned himself as the center of it. Everything, politics, culture, ceremony, moved around him. But this didn't happen instantly. Louis grew up during a time of instability. Rebellions. Nobles pushing back against royal authority. A young king watching power slip and stretch in ways that felt dangerous. And that leaves an impression. Because when he finally took full control, he made a decision. Power would never feel uncertain again. So he brought it inward. Not through fear alone. Not through absence. But through presence. Constant. Carefully constructed. He built Versailles. Not just as a palace. But as a system. A place where the nobility had to be. Had to attend. Had to participate in a structure that revolved entirely around him. Because if everyone is close to the king, they're easier to observe. Easier to influence. Easier to control. And Louis understood that perfectly. Daily life became ritual. Waking up. Dressing. Eating. All of it turned into ceremony. Not because it needed to be. But because it reinforced something. That the king wasn't just a ruler. He was the center of reality in that space. And people adapted. Nobles who once held independent power. Now competed for proximity. For attention. For small acknowledgments that carried enormous weight. A glance. A word. An invitation. Because in a system like that, attention becomes currency. And Louis controlled all of it. But even here, the pattern continues. Because maintaining that level of presence requires energy. Consistency. You can't step away. You can't drift. Because the moment you do, the structure begins to loosen. And Louis didn't step away. For decades. He maintained the image. The rituals. The control. And it worked. France became powerful. Culturally dominant. Recognized across Europe as something grand, something stable. But beneath that stability, there was pressure. Because systems built on constant performance don't leave much room for change. Everything has to stay aligned. And when it doesn't, the correction isn't always immediate. It builds. Slowly. Quietly. Until it reaches a point where adjustment becomes unavoidable. Louis himself never saw that collapse. Because during his lifetime, the system held. But after him, the weight of maintaining that same structure fell onto those who followed. And not everyone could carry it the same way. Which brings us back to something we've seen again and again. It's not just how power is used. It's how it's sustained. And whether that sustainability depends on one person. Or something broader. Louis XIV created a system that worked. As long as he was there to hold it together. And that's the quiet tension underneath even the most successful reigns. Because eventually, everyone leaves. And the structure has to continue without them. So now, as we move forward, we shift again. From controlled brilliance to something far more unpredictable. A ruler who embraced extremes without restraint. Commodus of Rome. A man who didn't just inherit power, but treated it like a stage. And himself, like the main performance. A ruler who didn't just sit on the throne. He stepped off it. And walked straight into the arena. Commodus of Rome. The son of Marcus Aurelius. Which already sets up a contrast. Because Marcus Aurelius was known for discipline. Restraint. Philosophy. A ruler who thought deeply about power. And then came Commodus. Raised inside that legacy. But drawn to something entirely different. Performance. Not the quiet kind. Not the controlled kind. But something visible. Immediate. Because Commodus didn't just want to rule Rome. He wanted to be seen by it. So instead of maintaining distance, instead of reinforcing the image of an untouchable emperor, he stepped into the public eye. Literally. Fighting in the arena. As a gladiator. Now, for anyone else, that would have been unthinkable. Because emperors were meant to represent stability. Distance. Authority. But Commodus broke that boundary. And at first, it fascinated people. Because it was different. Unexpected. An emperor who fought. Who performed. Who made himself part of the spectacle. But over time, that fascination changed. Because what began as novelty became routine. And routine, again, shifts perception. Commodus wasn't just appearing occasionally. He was centering himself in it. Renaming Rome. Associating himself with Hercules. Recasting his identity as something larger than a ruler. A figure of myth. And that's where things start to blur. Because once power becomes performance, it depends on reaction. Applause. Attention. Recognition. And if those responses begin to fade, the performance has to grow. Bigger. More extreme. Which pulls the ruler further away from the structure they're meant to maintain. And that's exactly what happened. While Commodus focused on spectacle, governance weakened. Decisions became inconsistent. Control shifted. Not outwardly at first, but internally. Because when the center of power becomes distracted, others begin to fill the gaps. Quietly. And again. The same pattern emerges. Not immediate collapse. Not dramatic rebellion. But slow instability. People adapting. Watching. Waiting. Until the balance shifts too far. And when it does, the correction comes. Commodus was assassinated. Not in the arena. Not in front of the crowd. But in private. Because even in a reign built on spectacle, the end often returns to silence. And with that, another structure resets. Another example of power moving beyond its limits. And being pulled back. So now, we continue. Because there's one more kind of ruler we haven't fully explored yet. Not one driven by performance. Not by fear. Not by absence. But by expansion. A figure who looked outward. And didn't stop. Alexander the Great. A king who didn't just hold power, but carried it across the world. And in doing so, changed everything around him. A story that doesn't stay in one place. Because this time, power doesn't sit still. Alexander the Great. King of Macedon. But that title doesn't stay contained for long. Because Alexander didn't inherit a finished system. He inherited momentum. His father, Philip II, had already begun expanding. Building strength. Creating the foundation of something larger. And when Alexander took over, he didn't slow that momentum down. He accelerated it. Campaign after campaign. Victory after victory. Moving across regions that had existed separately for centuries. And pulling them into something connected. But here's where his story shifts. Because expansion doesn't just change geography. It changes identity. At first, Alexander led as a Macedonian king. Clear role. Clear structure. But as his empire grew, that clarity started to blur. He encountered different cultures. Different systems. different ways of seeing power. And instead of keeping them at a distance, he absorbed them, adopted elements, adapted his image, began presenting himself not just as a king, but as something closer to a unifying figure across cultures. And that's where tension begins. Because the people who started with him, his generals, his army, they remembered who he was. And now they were watching him change. New customs, new expectations, even suggestions that he should be treated as divine. And again, the same question appears. Where does power stop? Because when you're constantly winning, constantly expanding, there's very little to push back against you. So the boundaries start to disappear. Alexander didn't just lead. He became the center of everything he created. And when that happens, everything depends on one person. Every decision, every direction, all of it tied to a single point. And that works, as long as that point remains stable. But Alexander's pace, his constant movement, his relentless expansion, didn't allow for stability. There was no pause. No moment where the system could settle. It was always moving forward. And eventually, that catches up. Not through defeat. Not through rebellion. But through limitation. Alexander died young. Unexpectedly. At a moment when his empire was still expanding. Still unfinished. And that's where everything shifts. Because without him, there was no clear structure to hold it all together. No single system strong enough to replace his presence. So the empire began to divide. Generals taking control of different regions. Fragmenting what had been unified. Not because it failed completely, but because it had been held together by one person's movement. And once that movement stopped, everything else had to find its own direction. So Alexander's story becomes something different from the others. Not collapse. Not correction. But dispersion. Power spreading outward. Instead of breaking inward. And leaving behind a legacy that continued. Just not in the same form. So now, as we step back slightly, notice the full pattern we've moved through tonight. Control. Excess. Instability. Absence. Performance. Fear. Perception. Movement. Different expressions. Of the same central force. Power. Pushed in different directions. And every time it moves too far one way, something shifts to bring it back. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes suddenly. But always. Inevitably. And now, we're not quite finished. Because there's one final layer left. Not a king. Not a single ruler. But something broader. The idea of power itself. And how it continues. Even when the people holding it change. And this time, we are consider a ruler who didn't just enjoy power. He tested it. Nero of Rome. Nero didn't begin as a monster. That's important. At the start, his reign was guided. Structured. Advisors helped him. Decisions were measured. For a while, things worked. But then, slowly, he began to step out of that structure. Less guidance. More independence. And with independence came experimentation. Because Nero wasn't satisfied just being emperor. He wanted expression. Art. Music. Performance. He sang. Acted. Performed publicly. And in another life. That might have been harmless. But here. He was emperor. And when the person with absolute authority begins to blur the line between ruler and performer, the system starts to shift. Because people don't know how to respond. Do they admire? Do they obey? Do they pretend? So they adapt. They applaud. They support. They mirror what they think is expected. And Nero, seeing that response, pushes further. Because again, no resistance feels like approval. And over time, his behavior becomes less controlled, more impulsive, more detached from consequence. Then comes the fire. Rome burns. Whether Nero caused it or not, almost doesn't matter. Because what matters is what followed. He used the destruction to rebuild, to reshape, to create something grander. But also, to redirect blame. Persecution begins. A search for someone else to hold responsible. And that's when fear returns to the system. Not the controlled fear of order, but reactive fear. Unpredictable. Because now, decisions don't feel stable. They feel personal. And when power becomes personal, it becomes dangerous in a different way. Nero isolates, distrusts,